Morning, everybody. Welcome to Retuning Your Firm, and it's episode 70, and it's Friday, the 25th of March, 2022, and we are a little over 4 weeks into the Ukraine conflict. What are we going to be talking about today? You'll see the slide in front of you, I'm sure. We're going to be looking at the whole area of cross-border targets, but in an interesting way, because I think they're the most vulnerable place if you're looking to build a business and you're very careful about not wanting to engage with toxic or inappropriate clients, and there are going to be a few more of those around, I suspect, given the sanctions, etc. So we'll be hearing from Itzik about that shortly. We're also looking at some of the societal pressure issues and how that might impact the way that firms actually roll out their ESG programs, and James is going to be helping us with that. And then how do you prepare for the unexpected? Actually, I was saying to Marcus, who's going to be talking about that, how do you prepare for the unthinkable? Which is actually an even more interesting question, because I think for a lot of people, we are in a world which for many people has been completely unthinkable. Certainly my children feel that way. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So let's just hit that to me. And delighted to be with you today. I'm, as you know, Richard Chaplin. I'm the founder and chief executive of the Managing Partners Forum. So what are we going to be talking about today? First of all, I'd like to just talk you through the panel that we have today. Well, first of all, we're going to hear from Itzik. Itzik Amiel is the founder of The Switch, and he's going to be talking about cross-border targets and business development opportunities. Welcome, Itzik, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts a little bit later.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Our second panel member is James Courtis-Pond. And James is the founder and chief executive officer of AnyData Solutions. And he's talking about how do you convert ESG aspirations into deliverable commitments. Now, those of you who know AnyData Solutions will know they do a huge amount of work around the supply chain. And supply chain is part and a very key part of the conversation, but there's many other elements that feed into delivering your commitments in an ESG context. So we're going to hear from James about those.
Good morning.
Our third presenter, our third panelist, our third guest is Marcus Dimbleby. And Marcus is a partner in Red Team Thinking. And if you haven't read the book written by Bryce Hoffman, you better read it, because it's one of the most interesting and relevant books around, in my view. And Red Team Thinking, very interesting. It comes from the military, as I understand it. And it's kind of saying, okay, let's make sure that all the options are covered. Let's ask all the why questions. Why this? Why this? Could this have happened? How would it happen? And there's a story that it was, I think Barack Obama said this was the most important document he got every day, was the one put together by the Red Team, helping him think through alternative scenarios as opposed to those that the groupthink and the normal Washington consensus had brought to his attention. So thank you for joining us, Marcus. And he's going to be talking a bit about Red Team Thinking. And it's, if you like, a process. How do you actually go about preparing for the unthinkable? Do you create your own team? Do you actually get people together wearing different headsets, mindsets? How do you actually approach it? And does that vary according to the size of the business? So it's going to be really interesting to hear what you have to say. Our final panel member, and Jeremy, as you know, is our regular. So welcome, Jeremy. And pleased you can join us today. He's coming about once a month, which is great. And really looking forward to your words of wisdom as somebody who has the in tray, like many of the people on the call today on the show. And we're bringing some interesting experts, all of whom have actually been on the show before, but sometime in the past. It was quite interesting because I went out to all the previous people who've been on the show recently, and I said, would you like to come on again? And I think I filled 30 slots in about 2 days. It was amazing, the response. So that just shows how much people really appreciate being on this show. And thank you to Jeremy for being a regular. And I always think the narrative of having somebody with us who's like not just me, but somebody else who's actually really understands how it goes. And good news, on June, we have Francesca back, because she will have finished her 6-month garden leave and is going to be taking up a new role as the global CEO of Baker Tilly International, which is a phenomenally a great promotion for her. So, but she said she wouldn't miss this show for the world. And she's very frustrated that she's had to miss it for 6 months because of the garden leave. So there you go. So that's our panel for today. And as I mentioned, I'm Richard Chaplin, and I'm the founder and chief exec of the Managing Partners Forum. So before we go on to the poll section, let's quickly run through a bit of forum news so that you're aware of what's going on. If you're not watching the videos from the past shows, don't miss out the fascinating ones from last week when we were looking at some of the Ukraine issues from cyber perspective with NCC, from Simon Slater looking at how do you actually What are the revised priorities, if you like? My son James Chaplin, who's based in Warsaw, giving, I thought, a very prescient assessment of the three options, plausible outcomes of the current situation. And 2 weeks on, he's still spot on, believe me. So do watch that one. And then the other one, we looked with John Rowland at whole over reputation and how can you actually prepare for a world in which all of a sudden societal pressure actually matters more than how can we tailor our product to make it perfect for a particular individual. And James, I know, will be picking up some of those themes again today, although his focus is slightly different. So what else am I talking about? The Mentor Match program. We've been running it for a few weeks now. And what's really interesting is that we're actually getting, and I can't believe this, but it's true, over 60% of the initial batch of matches suggested by the algorithm have resulted in mentorships. I'm told that's a very, very high percentage. So if you haven't signed up for it, whether it's a mentor or as a mentee, totally free. And it isn't just about matching. It's also the secure, confidential place for both parties to engage in and track all aspects of the mentoring relationship. So that's something that we're really proud to provide to the community. We're not charging for it. We think it's something that's really important. And we had actually recently a situation yesterday where from the moment I suggested to the mentor that they might be interested, the mentee was then contacted when the mentor said fine. They then contacted each other. They agreed to work together. They obviously decided to skip the proper test session. The whole process took 3 hours, which was astonishing. Couldn't believe it, but it happened. What's next? I mentioned it last couple of times we spoke. Innovation Summit, 18th of May, coming up, and that's got a mock board design sprint using Miro templates from the Fast Track Innovation Guide. The invite will be out, if not today, in a day or two's time, so watch this space. And lastly, there's a report that we were proud to have published with VacancySoft, looking at business management hiring trends by UK law firms, though the accountancy firms tell me they're very, very similar, over the past 5 years. So whether it's around marketing people, finance people, HR people, tech people, what's been going on? What are the hiring trends? Don't think anybody's produced anything like this. And as I said, the report is out at the moment. So if you do get a chance, if you're involved in any form of management or in one of those C-suite roles, it's a really interesting, valuable piece of research, which, as I said, has never been provided before by anybody because VacancySoft have the data on those areas in the way that nobody else does. So let's move on now. We're now going to talk about polls. And I think you've all done the polls before. Always appreciate your input. It's always great. And today's poll is actually going to be the quarterly one. And what we're looking at here is actually our quarterly tracker, which is the one that probably government really pays a lot of attention to. And we last did it in beginning of January, in fact. We're now at the end of March. I thought it might be an uneventful quarter. I think that was probably an oversight, certainly with what's been going on the last month. So to what extent has that changed the way that people feel? Before we do that, let's just run through what happened at the last poll. And if you recall, it was on cyber resilience. And what we found was that very few boards are actively managing cyber risk or indeed nudging their people to do the right thing. And we had a really interesting conversation about, was it best to encourage people to do the right thing or to tolerate and possibly not sanction those that actually facilitate attacks at senior level? I don't think there's an answer to that, but I think the general view of the panel was that nudging people to do the right thing was right, but that isn't happening, basically. There's lots of ignorance among the people who responded over how often, how many, just no knowledge. And if the people are at board level, that really is something that is a concern, we felt. The amount of money that people are investing is less than 2%. The NCC said 8% is probably more like normal. So again, we as a sector, and yet we're very exposed because we have so much great data available, which people could go and raid. And people aren't expecting that percentage to grow by much, a bit, but not huge amounts. There's a few of the cyber threats. The one that I particularly picked up was eavesdropping, man in the middle, sometimes called, that they're not being actively managed. The odd phishing was, yes, but there were some that were slipping through, perhaps not getting the attention, or people weren't aware of what their IT team were up to. And the things that people felt were getting in the way, where were the risk indicators? Well, there was a lack of technical expertise, a lack of awareness of what cyber risk really meant. Some firms felt their tech architecture was a bit legacy, wasn't really suitable. And the main one, I think, was poor comms. People just weren't sharing. It was seen as, oh, it's something the board can delegate to a small group of experts to deal with. And of course, everybody knows that cyber is fundamentally around people and process, and the tech comes in third. If you don't get the people bit right and the process bit right, then you are exposed. So a couple of charts on that one. Again, I don't think you'll be able to see it, especially if you've got a small screen, but think about it this way. The higher you are, the better it is. And I've shown this at 2 dates, at June and March. June was last year, 6 months, 9 months ago. 11th of March, obviously 2 weeks ago. And the better that you want to be up at the top, basically. At the bottom, it says you're unsure, the board doesn't view it as a risk at all, etc. At the top, it's an integral part of our innovation and growth. The main one is the middle. Our board is kept informed of cyber risks on a regular basis. Well, they're kept informed of lots of things, aren't they? To what extent are public rewards given by your firm for active prevention of a cyber attack by somebody in a non-specialist role? And over to the far right is consistently, which scores 0. Then you have normally, which gets about 5%. Sometimes is in the 20s, and 80 nearly percent say never. And those numbers haven't shifted in 9 months, which, considering everything that's going on, it seemed to me a bit strange. And the second question we ask, and it's almost got the similar pattern, to what extent are public sanctions given by your firm for conduct by a director or partner that facilitated an attack? And we have a conversation around, are sanctions the best way to approach each people who do something that is inappropriate? But we all know that people do kind of follow behavior. So this is what's done around here, then it's fine by everybody. So I think that it's got a place, but again, almost a very similar pattern. Never's up into sort of 70%, consistently might hit 10%. The rest is somewhere in between. So clearly management are not looking at it in terms of how do we encourage behaviors which will reduce the cyber. And I always think of it a bit like you're running from the saber-toothed tiger, saber-toothed tiger. The key is to be faster than the other man. You don't have to be sitting on a motorbike. As long as you're faster than the other person, you should be okay. So are you at least making yourself relatively secure? And that may be something that comes up in a red team context as well, I suspect. We'll find out from Marcus in due course. So what are we going to do today? We're doing the quarterly anonymous quarterly sector trends tracker. It's a bit of a mouthful. If you've done it before, some of you will have done, I suspect. So I know this is quite a popular show. We're looking at the issues that are being discussed at partner director meetings. We're looking at your business priorities, the management activities, and the barriers to optimal performance. What you're projecting in terms of activity, headcount, and new work over the next year. The home working extent, again, that we've been tracking that throughout the pandemic. Has that settled down, or is that still where it was maybe a year ago? And therefore, what that means in office space requirements. And then the last one is really, what are some of the key metrics for a successful firm and the extent to which you feel your firm is able to tick that box? So what are the areas that are carrying the most weight? It's the usual ones, which is always finance. Marketing has fallen back a bit to a mere 24%. That's quite a lot lower. The one that's come through a lot higher is operational performance. So it looks like money and delivering the clients is actually the key to it, whereas the whole area of getting a new work has dropped away, and that was very, very high at various stages of the pandemic. Which are the areas which people consider will help the firm achieve its goals most? Communication, that doesn't surprise you, I'm sure. Communication being number one, communicating effectively. And the second area is getting the best from your team. So they're very much both people-based activities. I think that comes quite strongly. In terms of the top priorities for the firm, let's see which is the one that's coming through. It's quite spread today, actually. There's nothing, I mean, again, increasing operational efficiency is coming in number one, but it's not, everything's getting a fair amount of the developing commercialities up there, developing skills and capabilities. Those are probably the top three, looking at that question. What's getting in the way? The constraints, well, employee turnover, by far and away, the one that's highest. It's interesting because I remember back in 2 years ago, a little bit, when we were a few months into the pandemic, that actually got 0. Nobody scored employee turnover in their top 3, none. That's not the case at the moment, that's for sure. We're getting that from all sides. And that really does stand out amongst all the others. I suppose then fee pressures come through probably second, but it's quite a bit behind employee turnover. That's definitely getting a very big thumbs down, if that's the right terminology. In terms of where do you expect to expand or contract, nobody's expecting to contract. So that again is similar with back in, excuse me, last time we ran this poll. A small, about 10% no change, 90% looking to grow. That's in the context of their level of activity. Very similar message when it comes to the flow of new work. Very similar message when it comes to headcount growth. So really not very many changes. Office space requirements, Some people are now trickling into more. We haven't seen very much more, but you've got 18%, so they want more space, and a little bit, not that much more, saying they want less, actually. Interesting, about 50, about the same. So that's definitely a shift. It was a time when everybody was going to be giving up their offices, I think, or thought they were anyway. How much of the time are people likely to be working from home? And that's nudging around between a half and a quarter of the time at home are the two which come through quite strongly, which is sort of, I guess, the idea of working sort of maybe 3 days, possibly in the office. So it kind of relates to that, 3-4 days. Which of these statements are true? Which are the one that comes through very strong? Our leaders are accessible. That's great. That's very important. Are they transparent? Yes, 47%, but that's not quite the same as 88 who say they're accessible. And then the other ones, they're all pretty good. They share strategic options. That's about 60%. Employees are valued at least as highly as other shareholders. When it comes to shared pain, possibly a bit lower. I think that's always been the case. Remote working has increased productivity at our firm. Only 12% of you think that's true. So that's quite an interesting stat. And our firm is on track for post-COVID success, say 53% of you, but only 29% think your clients are in the same place. So there's clearly a, what should we say, a disconnect there between what the clients think and where you see your clients, and where you see yourselves. Now, of course, as you are actually reliant on your clients for your revenues, that mismatch can't continue forever. So that, I think, is quite interesting as well. Our first guest, and our guest, as you know, is Itzik Amiel, and he is the founder of The Switch, and he's coming to talk about toxic clients and related matters. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. So good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I mean, the subject was actually puzzled me myself, because do I really call people toxic people or toxic client? Or so I asked myself first the question, what is toxic? And here's the 3 things I found out. There are 3 sort of toxic things. One, people are toxic in their behavior, and I hope none of you have them as your client, as your friend. I mean, if it's your parents, I'm sorry for that, but those people you want out of your life. Then you have the toxic thing that the people are not toxic, but the business is toxic. Again, I'm not sure if you want to accept those as a client or not. Well, we're not going to talk about it too much now. But the third, I think that's what the current circumstance shows us. Although the business is not toxic, the people may not be toxic, but the circumstances makes it toxic. But what do you do in those situations? Now, let me tell you two warnings in the beginning. First, all those things, of course, are work in progress. So things that being not toxic in the past may be toxic later on. The second is, don't think that if one of them happens, it necessarily makes everything toxic. What I mean is, be careful. If circumstances are toxic, it doesn't mean that the client is toxic or the business is toxic. So I don't want you to categorize or stigmatize people or businesses just because of circumstances, and then we have to deal with that. So 2 questions I think we should all ask ourselves. First, what do you do if you have them already as your portfolio as a client, as your client in your business development? What do you do if you have those clients who are, or the circumstances make them toxic? And the second, how do you deal with it for the future? How do you prevent getting those toxic clients to come and be part of your practice, etc.? And of course, it's not about just serving them. We have all the concern about reputation, branding. How will other people look at you? Maybe other clients will leave you because of that. So that's the concern, actually. It's not about how you serve them. So the first question I said, how do you do if you have them in your portfolio? What if 50% of your portfolio is those toxic clients, or clients that come in with toxic circumstances? What if it's 100%? I have a friend who has actually a law firm here in the Netherlands, and he only focuses on Russian clients. He actually married to a Russian lady who she's stuck now in Russia, and he lives in the Netherlands, and they can enter the country now, and he lost all his clients. What do you do then? Think about it a second, but, all the time before, we always talk about the business development. We talk about you need to niche your firm, you need to do specific thing. This person niche his firm, but look what happened. Toxic circumstances. Do you want to put all the eggs in the same basket, or you want to put them all over and do other things? It's a very good thinking, but I mean, you cannot predict it in advance. So first I will say here, you don't have many choices. If there's toxic circumstances, you have no choice. So first, don't try to be sneaky. I know some people trying to find any opportunities still to work with these clients that nobody will see. Don't be sneaky. Everything will be seen. You have to work for the good of us as humanity. Second, clients understand. If circumstances become toxic, clients understand themselves. And you know what? They may leave by themselves. You don't have to get rid of those toxic people or toxic clients or toxic circumstances. They're going to leave. So they do half of the job for you. And maybe it's also an opportunity to learn that only for circumstances, but also for client in the future, if you have future toxic client. With that, let me move to the second question. I ask, what happens if for the future, you don't want to get those people in your portfolio? What would you do? And I know Richard wrote to me when we discussed it in short. He said, what about due diligence? And I'm asking you, will you do due diligence? Did you ever do due diligence? Didn't you laugh? I used to be in the corporate management services, and every client used to ask for compliance due diligence. But isn't it stupid? Isn't it like asking your new employee to get you a recommendation? It's a stupid request, because where they're going to go? To the enemies, people who hate them? That's not enough. It's almost like Googling to find people on the first page on Google. That's what they want you to find about them. Go to page 26 in Google, find what they want to hide from you. So maybe due diligence is not the right thing. I remember when we had corporate services, we had a lot of Russian clients. We used to even hire the KGB guy who used to take pictures. And I remember vividly, he used to take pictures of the wife of the client, of the wife of the U-boat, to show us it's real. The guy, by the way, got killed. So do you want to have those people in your practice to help you? I mean, where have you been? So maybe that's bringing me to the second opportunity. Now, due diligence, maybe more business intelligence. And I suggest all of you in the legal world to look outside of legal world. Look at I used to help one of the best professor in business intelligence, went with him to trade show. Literally saw, without mentioning name, one of the sporting goods company. And when they go to a trade show, they took 20 people, had a few rooms, had computer, sent people to the floor asking questions, and all that information showed them a lot of information about their competitors. You can do the same about your clients. So business intelligence, there's a lot of tools, a lot of knowledge out of the legal world, out of the accounting world. Go somewhere else. Don't try to find them in our world, because they are just primitive there. Go outside to other industries, you find them and use them. And maybe the most favorite one for me will always be networking. See, how will you find about other people before they come in quote circumstances? If you engage with your network on a regular basis, you get so much information. In the networking world, excuse me to be a bit vulgar here, we say a good networker is the person who knows who went to do at night. So much details and so many things. You're not going to find it online, I promise you. And pay attention to meta information. The information people share with you without even noticing. Look, for example, on the background of us as a speaker. Can you learn about each of us something? You know what we like? How do we look like? How do we behave? If you're not going to capture that information, you're not going to find it nowhere, not in the CRM system, nowhere. That's the meta information that people share with you, and you can use it, but also for the follow-up that most of us are neglecting. And maybe the last one is when you do networking, I love to use the term boomerang referrals. What does it mean? Why do we love so much referrals? Because if you go to the people who you already know, like, and trust, who refer your business, and they'll help you take out those toxic circumstances, people in business. How do they do that? By referring you other people, because people like to refer people they like themselves. We like to be liked. So they will refer people they like, and they fear that if they refer you the wrong people, they may hurt the relationship with you. So they actually help you select the right people to your practice, not attract toxic people around. That's it for me for now. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Itzik. That was fantastic. Really interesting to hear what you had to say there, and food for thought, I think. I'm sure Jeremy will have thoughts on some of those ones in a second. But before we get to that, I'm delighted that James Courtis-Pond is coming to talk to us today. And James is talking about how can you convert your ESG aspirations into deliverable commitments. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Richard, and good morning, everybody. Can't help but start off, can I, with the fact that in the poll, supply chain and sustainability scored 0 in relation to current business attention. And I'm here to share with you why I think that focus is very, very probably going to change. The current avalanche of global, regional and national environmental, social governance, what we call ESG regulations, is only going to grow. Leadership in all sectors is definitely under pressure to deliver increasingly on ambitious ESG goals. There's a great report, survey by KPMG 2021 called the CEO Outlook that showed that 6 out of 10 CEOs are seeing increased demands from stakeholders to see more ESG reporting and transparency. And who are these stakeholders? Well, they're obviously the key ones are investors, lenders, regulators, customers, and staff, who are all expecting their organizations to have a positive impact on the environment, that's the E, through sustainable business practices, social issues, the S, through inclusivity, diversity, and equity, and of course finally G, reducing governance risk in decision making to decrease corporate mismanagement. And this huge growth in global ESG frameworks has overlapped with at least 3 massive global world changes that are all also impacting your supply chains at the same time as ESG. COVID and the policies to design it have impacted global supply chains, plus a global government focus on sustainable recovery, which is a key to the S, which is inclusion and diversity. COP26 ramped up scrutiny on all of the E, environmental, climate change and decarbonisation. And of course, the Russia-Ukraine war, which means not only a focus on Russia sanctions relevant to the G of the ESG, but also impacting again global supply chains for a second time. And these all highlight this really tight relationship between ESG supply chains and business environments. Russia is the leading global player, as we all know, in oil and natural gas, and the push to green has meant that Europe is now exposed to Russian oil and gas supply restrictions, especially German industrial output, and that can affect your supply chain because your suppliers and the suppliers to your suppliers are all getting impacted. Russia and Ukraine account for roughly 30% of total global wheat exports, and the Ukraine is actually also, not many people know, a massive supplier of some of the key unique minerals, sometimes the only place in the world where they're getting some of the minerals they need for the technological transition from carbon to clean energy. These are going to impact stuff. So this is why more leadership is focusing on the integration of supply chain information and supplier ESG analysis, and the AnyData platform is one of a few, of course, that can help in that area, because I think perhaps 70% of ESG compliance really involves your supply chain, and it means that your organization has to understand, or is going to have to understand, its supply chain. Who are your suppliers, what goods and services they sell you, their carbon usage and their commitments, their modern slavery act policies, the anti-bribery act policies, where these suppliers are located, because the combination of your supply chain feeds into a massive part of who you are as an organization. Hence, understanding ESG across your supply chain is key. So let me just quickly pick up on a few ways in which clients are converting ESG aspirations into deliverable commitments. Essentially, it's through using innovative tech, which again, innovation scored really lowly on the low on the poll, right? But it's going to be through using innovation tech to understand where they are, how to set targets, and how to measure progress, because failing to do so is going to hit the bottom line. So let's start with how do you do that? Really quickly, an extremely quick, smart, detailed analysis of your supply chain, understanding exactly who's all in your supply chain, can be done in 24 hours, top to bottom, categorizing those suppliers into the right sectors, honing in on gas, electric, waste management, water, air, land travel, temporary labor, the kind of things that hit high on the E and the S categories, mapping those suppliers so you understand across your entire supply chain which suppliers are in high-risk companies. I haven't got a client that this week or the last 3 weeks hasn't been focusing on their dashboards to see exactly which suppliers they might have in Russia or other areas that are seeing knock-on effects, and of course the Ukraine and etc. And then of course you need to look at ESG analysis. That largely comes through a supplier communication portal where the suppliers fill in the information you need to know from them about their carbon footprint, procurement, sustainability policies, modern slavery, etc. As well as then uploading your own contracts with your suppliers to understand, do you have the right clauses to show that your ESG policy is actually in practice being put into effect. For example, do we have modern slavery act clauses with all our suppliers? Do we have anti-bribery act clauses? Have our suppliers signed up to our sustainability policy? These are the things that are going to impact your brand if something doesn't go well, and we can try and stop that happening earlier rather than later. Inbuilt methodologies for scoring the ESG data, and then bringing it all together with automated reporting designed to help articulate to your stakeholders the steps they're taking to address the ESG concerns. So let me just leave you with a couple of takeaways. Number one, ESG is not going away, it's going to get bigger. Number two, how ESG is managed will positively or negatively affect your brand, your ability to raise finance, and importantly, it will also affect your ability to attract new business. Beauty parades are more and more requiring professional firms and other organizations to tell you where you are in your ESG reporting across your business, and it can be a winner or loser kind of issue in a beauty parade. And finally, if you combine it with your supply chain analysis, because you don't actually have a choice, you can also reduce cost, improve cash flow, and improve operational efficiencies, which I noticed were all very high on the poll today. So thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, it's interesting. I often think that people say operational efficiency, but they don't actually drill down and realize that within that is some pretty key issues, that possibly innovation is one, as James said, the whole area of supply chain and being focusing on the sort of societal issues or others, but they're wrapped up under operations. But now we're now going to turn to our third guest and welcome Marcus Dimbleby. Marcus is partner in Red Team Thinking. And if you're not familiar with red teams, I mentioned earlier, it's a very, very helpful concept, comes from the military, as I'm sure he'll explain, but it's something that I think we're all facing the unthinkable at the moment. And could that have been something we'd been preparing for or not? And I think he's going to argue quite strongly that it is. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you, Richard. So preparing for the unexpected by thinking the unthinkable. Who could have even thought of that? So yes, red team thinking, it's not something that's a made up tool by a consultancy. This is a capability that's been around since the days of Socrates. So 2,500 years of evolution of this capability through the Prussians fighting Napoleon, through the Israelis during the Yom Kippur War, and then post 9/11, the CIA stood up the Red Cell and the US Army stood up the Red Teaming University. And it's continued to flourish in militaries, government agencies, and intelligence agencies across the world since then. And we've taken it and ported it into business after Bryce Hoffman, the author of Red Teaming, went through the US Army's schoolhouse back in 2015, because we saw the power of this capability of helping people think differently. So if I asked everybody, are we all rational and critical thinkers, as Adam Smith, Scottish philosopher, had us believe for over 300 years, we'd all say, yes, we are. It's our default lazy brain convincing us of that. But Daniel Kahneman, that great psychologist and philosopher, came along and proved it was absolute nonsense. And he said, our brain is this machine for jumping to conclusions. It sends us off down false avenues, convincing us that things are as they are, but really it's not, because our brain is clever and it's very lazy and it wants to go for the quickest solution. It wants to satisfy, as we call that. And that's fine when you're, as we talked about earlier, avoiding the saber-toothed tiger on the plains and that high-speed car that comes around the corner. The system one thinking kicks in and we react. But in a complex world, we can't react. We have to take a moment, we have to think, we have to respond and engage what's called system two thinking, which is far less error prone. Because today we live in, as we're all aware, this what's called a complex adaptive system. And within that, the system is made up of so many parts that we can't predict the behaviors, because everything is moving at different paces, different speeds, and reacting and responding to different things within the environment. And this is what's also known as a VUCA world, VUCA. And that, again, came from the military. It was from the US Army War College in the 80s. And it talked about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this was a state of the nation for the military's perspective post the Cold War. Add to that today, H for hyperconnectivity, because everything we're now doing and seeing is hyperconnected across the world. Events that are happening are immediately transported through the internet, through communications, through the media, and therefore decisions we make are instant released, and therefore we can't retract them as we could do before. And then if you recall back to 2002, Donald Rumsfeld talked about unknown unknowns in his famous speech. And at the time, he was ridiculed by the media for this nonsense speech that he gave, very confusing. But also another great Nobel Prize winner, Thomas Schelling, he said, one thing a person cannot do, no matter how rigorous their analysis or heroic their imagination, is to draw up a list of things that would never occur to them. Right? So it doesn't matter how smart, clever, intelligent, good looking you are, there are certain things that will just never occur to you. But somebody knows. And there's an old great Chinese proverb that says, none of us is as smart as all of us, which is why today we need to source the wisdom of the crowd, look to our people. And it's really interesting, therefore, when you look at the problems today, just going on the survey that came through, that survey showed us that we're focusing on money, business, and people. That needs to invert. If we focus on people first, That supports the business, and then the money comes as an outcome and an afterthought. If we focus on the money, we lose that impact of what our people can bring. And the reason why this is most executives today don't want to think the unthinkable. They find it too uncomfortable. They'd rather hide behind what we call comforting lies and, not face into those uncomfortable, ugly truths that we all know about. And that's why so many businesses that we see die from self-inflicted wounds. And it's because of this irrational thought that we have. It's because of the cognitive biases that affect so many of the decisions made today. We have normalcy bias, where we can't really accept that things are going to get as bad as they do. Status quo bias, we want to keep things as they are. Ostrich effect, we put our head in the sand and don't really want to focus on the problems. Longevity bias, that's a great one. We've always done it this way. We want to keep it doing it that way. It's comfortable. Then also optimism bias. Often people are overly optimistic with their plans and their strategies, and they don't see these external threats. So as I said, the solution really is to look to your people. We have to create diverse teams, and we hear sort of DE&I programs, diversity, equality, and inclusion. Those have to stop being tick box quota-driven agendas. They have to be for real. And we had a great client last week. He said, if you have diversity without inclusion, you have delusion. So it's really about engaging those people, enabling them and empowering them to ask those uncomfortable questions. And once they get that support and recognition from the executive that that's what their task is, then you start to unleash greatness. And that's where we have with Red Team Thinking what we call a cognitive capability and a toolkit. It's not just a set of tools you can use. You have to understand the mindset, which is really important. And if you have that, that allows you to challenge the status quo. It allows you to ask better questions. It allows us to challenge our assumptions, ask what if, topple those dominoes about a major event in the future that could have a massive impact, and see what the first, second, third, fourth order impacts are. It allows us to ask about failure, talk about failure comfortably. This has been a disaster. We're on the headline news tomorrow. How did that occur? Work backwards. And we worked with Dr. Gary Klein, who came up with the pre-mortem, that great tool that's been around now for 30 years. Instead of doing a post-mortem, which we know is very uncomfortable, do a pre-mortem, contemplate failure before it happens. And I worked with him a couple of years ago, and we came up with what's called a triple filter method. Ask about 1, the impact of an event, 2, the likelihood of it happening, and then 3, do you have an ability to do something about it? And understand that then allows you to prioritize those risks and put them in order of how you address them. And then looking at the tools to do that, unleash the cognitive capability of your people, engage critical thinking, enable distributed decision-making, and encourage that diversity of thought. And if you do that, that's how you can plan for the unexpected, and that's how we can think the unthinkable. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Jeremy, you've got quite an interesting smorgasbord today of topics that have been raised. As an accountant, do you agree that people come before finance? Start off there, but tell us what you think. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you very much to all the speakers, all very interesting. And I have just written down Marcus's comment about tick box, because I think all of the 3 things that have been covered today, which I'd put in client and client engagement, and if we look at money laundering and onboarding, sometimes it has been treated as a tick box exercise. If we look at the green agenda, sometimes that's treated as a tick box exercise. And of course, Marcus's comments around risk and risk registers, etc., also a tick box exercise. And I think all 3 of those are having to change significantly from being a tick box exercise. In terms of our strategy, I'm very proud to say that the number 1 priority in our strategy is people. So we have 5 core headings in the strategy that we've just launched. Finance doesn't appear in any of them. Key people is number 1. Risk is 2. Quality of clients, and technology, and there's one other. But so absolutely, people is front and center of what we are doing at the moment. And one of the speakers said, if you get that part of the business right, then a lot of the other things will follow, whether that's clients, whether that's profitability, etc. I don't really know where you want me to start, Richard. Perhaps if I just pick up on the quality clients bit from Itzik, and we've talked about that a lot over various series of the Friday morning sessions about quality clients, and the limited resource of people, and again that was touched on in the survey, means that we focus on quality clients. I think that's become increasingly in the forefront, and certainly events over the last month have caused us to look very closely at our client base, and that's been driven for obvious reasons by what's happening, but also our regulators are interested, our PI brokers are suddenly interested in where we have clients, and that whole, I am now meeting on a weekly basis with our head of onboarding, and we have a log of high risk clients that we go through every week to look at, and indeed our whole onboarding and new client process has been ramped up as well. I recently attended at the ICAW a new film that they've launched called All Too Familiar. If any of you can access that, I would encourage you to watch that, about clients and taking on quality clients, etc. One point perhaps that it did just mention was that referral piece, which I think I understand where it's coming from, but perhaps I would also highlight the familiarity point. I think sometimes we can get too familiar with the source of new clients, etc., which perhaps doesn't cause us to go through the processes that we should. But I'd absolutely agree that understanding the business operations, getting under the skin of that, obviously source of funds is the big issue at the moment, and a phrase that is talked about an awful lot. Should I pause there? And
Yeah, no, look, that's great, Jeremy. Thank you very much. And maybe just Itzik, I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about business intelligence and how possibly we weren't as a sector very smart in the way we approach that. I mean, what would you call good business intelligence? What sort of thing could firms be doing, do you think?
Thanks very much, Richard and James. I mean, I agree. Jeremy, sorry, I agree with everything you said. The problem with business intelligence starts where the place with it within firms. I mean, as you know, I'm as being many times in law firms. I mean, in law firms with librarian. So, do you really seriously thinking that law firm will take it seriously if they give the business intelligence responsibility for librarian? Because most people don't respect librarian. If I say librarian to most of you, they're thinking about this old person sitting there, dusty, and sitting there waiting somebody come to the office library, pick up a book. I mean, do you really see this person knocking on the door of the CEO, of the managing partner, say, you have to listen to me now because our competitors are moving in the wrong direction? And also you have to pay attention to what we called, I used to do it when I was a young lawyer, when everybody wants to go somewhere and I didn't want them to come, I said, wow, this market is really hot. And of course, I know everybody will copy you and you go the other direction, so misleading business intelligence also exists. How do you find out what is real, what is not real, what is genuine business intelligence, what not? I mean, as I think Jeremy said it rightly, I mean, it is not one time you're looking for it. It's not ticking the box. It's a process. If you're going to, on a regular basis, take all the data you're already taking and put it somewhere that is valid, it will be written on the wall. You'll see it in front of you. You don't have to have any tool, but really look into the data and details. But if you don't, and do it only on once in a while, then you're not going to see it. So I think if you're asking the right question, if you meet the right people, if you be curious enough, it's all over there all the time. I mean, I knew, for example, Russia because I listened to a 60 minutes interview last year, July. And I predict the future. No, but they said it's coming in the coming 3 years. It comes 6 months later. So if you just listen and observe and write, then you know what's going to happen. And then it will happen because we are now creating our own future. It's not something that human beings are hoping to happen. We're creating it in our own hands by saying things, by talking things, by sharing things. So that's
Thanks very much. That's great. And James, picking up that point for a minute about perhaps less around the business intelligence, but having gathered it, then I know you have a tool that does a lot of the analysis. But to what extent can somebody do it without a tool, do you think?
It's a good question. I think it really depends on the complexity of how much data, because some issues are very data-based, and some issues are more thinking-based. But if you're looking at an area that has an enormous amount of data input, I think it's impossible to come up with smart business intelligence these days without using clever tools and platforms to help you. But that's not all. That's not the only piece of the puzzle. The data is not the only piece, but I think it's often a core piece.
Thanks. Marcus, just picking up data there as well. If somebody was to set up one of these red teams, I mean, how much is that data driven and how much is that thinking?
Both. I think, as James mentioned, data is key, but it's not the only thing. And the problem we're seeing is that I call it DDM, data-driven decision making, where people are relying on the facts, relying on the data that's telling them what they think. And obviously, we all know we can manipulate data or read it in any way, shape, or form to make it comfortable. And I think, therefore, the analysis of that data is where red team thinking really comes in, because you can take what appears to be factual data, but then interpret it into the context of where it's come from, what it means for the business, and also consider what's going on around the business. Because again, it's people not seeing those unknown unknowns. We talk a lot about deliberate disruption. So start disrupting yourself by thinking like your competitor, thinking like the enemy, and therefore by using that data in the context of cognitive understanding, you get a far better product of stepping forward and understanding where you're going, and better decisions are made from that.
Perhaps bringing Jeremy in now, that this idea of disruption and actually having people in the organization who are asking the awkward questions and not being willing to have the door closed in their face. I mean, how do you manage that without creating internal conflict?
Yeah, I think I think at the moment, certainly in our firm, we've created an environment and a culture where that is encouraged. I think partners are very accepting of that. So certainly, I think, and it comes back to what Marcus was talking about a little bit, we have strengthened our ops team, or in the process of strengthening our ops team. So whether that's our people head, our IT head, our finance head, etc., to really be high caliber individuals that are going to challenge the group of partners. At the end of the day, we're just accountants. What we need is people in those operations areas that are really going to challenge our thinking, and I think that is proving to be very successful. And being a tight-knit group as well, I think in that context is important, such that there is regular communication, and that communication is encouraged. So I think, creating an environment where people are encouraged to comment, and having strong and senior people in those operational roles. Now, I appreciate not every organization is of a size that can support those individuals. I think the other thing that we've done as well recently, or about to do, we've agreed to do, we haven't yet implemented, but it will be implemented very soon, and it cuts across what James was saying as well in terms of the governance, is we have agreed as a business to recruit 2 independent non-executives, which is the first time that we've done that. So, and again, they will be high caliber individuals, very high caliber individuals. Of course, they won't necessarily, they'll be paid, but they won't have a slice of the action in the business, but they will challenge us. They will really challenge us. And if they don't like what they see, they will go. They don't need to be with us. So I think that's very good, both from an ESG point of view, but also coming back to Marcus's points in terms of challenging us as a business, and looking at us critically. That's why we want to do it. That's why we've agreed to bring these people in. So it would be a bit silly then not to listen to the comments and things that they have to say.
Well, that was a really great way to kind of get to what is sadly, I'm afraid, we're a few seconds before time. So let me just quickly switch to the gallery mode. So I think on behalf of all our guests today, I'd like to thank Marcus for having helped us think about there are ways to think about the unthinkable, or to prepare for it possibly even, because, at the end of the day, I always think that the Ukrainian army in 2014 realized that the Russians were going to do something. And so they've spent 8 years preparing for it, much to the Russian surprise. So there you go. I'd like to thank Itzik for having taken on a brand new topic for him around toxic clients, which I don't think is something he'd really thought of before. But I spoke to him yesterday, and he said, everyone don't know anything about that. And he's produced a superb analysis, which I shall enjoy watching. So thank you very much for that. And I think you've got many conference speeches there on that topic over the next month or two, I suspect. I'd like to thank James for having reminded us that it isn't just about the data, it's also about the thinking. But if you are going to do the data, then do it properly, because the complex world we live in means that you can't just work with a spreadsheet. You've got to have something much more, a dashboard that's actually much more highlighting trends. Thank you all for completing the trends survey a few minutes before, which government I know will find interesting. And then thank you, of course, to Jeremy for having come in and shared his thoughts. As always, I really appreciate that you're willing to share things before they happen. Most people I know in professional services only talk about things after they've happened, but I always like the fact that you're willing to share ideas, because hopefully we can then help influence your ideas in turn. And that's, I think, part of what being this great community and network is. So on behalf of myself, I'd like to say thank you to our guest today. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another round of interesting and inspiring guests. I hope it won't be Ukraine number 3, but who can tell? On that happy note, over to you. Bye for now.